Hi, I'm Linda from Sewing Bee Fabrics. I want to show you how you can make a patchwork cape. The cape I'm going to make today was inspired for World Book Day by a story called Princess Precious and the Peasant Girl.
Here's my cape. Ta-da! Again!
I love it!
1, 2, 3, go!
The cape is basically a half circle shape with a little bit cut out for the neck. But to make it easier to draw the pattern, we're basically going to be drawing a quarter circle and cutting it on the fold. Measure the neck and add a tiny little bit extra so that we're not going to make it too tight. Then find a plate or similar that has the same size on half of its side as the whole size of the neck. I've used wide wrapping paper for my pattern, so draw a quarter of the plate on the top corner. You might want to mark your plate first to make sure that you're definitely drawing a quarter of the side. Next, you need to measure the length from the neck down to whatever length you want your cape. Then measure out at various points from the curve of your cutout down to this length, join them up, and it should have a nice curved shape that will make a quarter circle. You're going to cut this out in one piece of your lining fabric, and I just used a light polycotton. Just leave yourself a seam allowance all the way around except on the folded side. If you want to make your cape plain, all you need to do is cut out another of those in the same shape but with your top fabric, but I made mine as a patchwork top like the story. I've made my squares a touch over 4 inches, which is about 10.5 centimetres, and I needed somewhere between 170 and 180 of them. And that was to cover a cape that was about 70 centimetres in length. You'll also want a touch extra to make a tab for the buttonhole. I made mine around 3.5 inches by 1.5 inches with a curved top. That's about 8.5 centimetres by a touch over 3.5 centimetres. Plus you're going to want a pretty button too. I laid out my lining fabric and then arranged all my squares on top of it. That made sure that I didn't have a cluster of one colour together, and I had them all in the right direction for where I wanted them to fall on the cape. I gathered them up in order from right to left, then clipped them together with a number of which row they were to stop them all from getting muddled. Take one of your piles at a time, pin them together, making sure that you've got right sides together for each seam so that they make your line again. I used a 1/4 inch quilting foot to make sure I stitched all of my squares together with the same seam allowance. Then, because we're not going to be quilting these down to the lining, you're going to want to finish the seams at the back. I used an Overcast foot to do this, so I can zigzag my stitch over the edge of the fabric. When you're stitching the squares and overlocking, you might want to chain stitch your pieces together. This means that when you finish one, you pick up another one a little bit further down, you put it up next to it. Make sure that you're going forwards and backwards at the start and end of each square to secure your stitches, and then all you need to do is do a little snip between the squares to free them, and that saves time and thread. Once you've finished sewing all of your squares into lines, we need to press the seams out to make sure that it lines up perfectly. When I'm doing a project with pieces small like this, I like using a hair straightener to press my seams instead. Next, take your patchwork pieces back over to your lining fabric and put them in the positions that you'd want all of your lines, and also make sure that you've got enough squares to definitely cover your area. Once they were pinned, I decided to roll them up inside the lining. I'm not stitching the lining at all, it was just to save myself from spiking myself repeatedly on pins. Sew your lines exactly the same way that you sewed your squares, just unwinding it far enough from the lining fabric that it keeps most of the pins still in place and out of your way, but keeping it away from the sewing machine. Then you'll want to finish those seams again with a zigzag stitch either over the edge of the fabric or just next to the fabric if you haven't got an Overcast foot. To sew your button tab, make sure that you've got right sides of the fabric facing together, so up the long side, around the curve and back down the long side, leaving the bottom open. Clip the curved edges and then turn it inside out. The clipping will help it sit flatter once it's turned. To put a buttonhole in it, you'll want a buttonhole foot for your machine. Most buttonhole feet have got markings along the side. You can use them to decide how big to make your buttonhole. Simply pass your button into the hole and then move the movable part down to the bottom. Then if you're going to use a fat button like me, make sure that you slide it out a little bit further to accommodate for the extra width that has to pass through the buttonhole as well. Then just check that against your fabric tab so you know where you want to position it. Different machines have slightly different ways of stitching buttonholes, so just stitch yours out as your machine tells you to. To open up the buttonhole, I prefer to use a seam ripper. I put the seam ripper in and rip a very small distance next to one of the edges. Then I turn it around, put the seam ripper back in the opposite end and rip until I meet the hole. Then that way I know I can't accidentally rip any stitches. Just double check afterwards that your button definitely does fit and that you don't need to extend your buttonhole. Lay your patchwork pieces down with your lining fabric on top and then just trim away any of the excess parts. Take your tab and just sandwich it in between layers. You want to go along the straight line just below where the neck is. Once you have the edges pinned together, you want to sew around the entire cape, leaving just a small gap around 3 inches or 8 centimetres somewhere along the bottom line, and then we're going to turn it through that. I like to add a few extra stitches forwards and backwards just as I go over the tab, and that will reinforce it and make it harder for it to get pulled out. So here's the gap that I left just for finishing turning. But before you do actually turn it, if you put little snips along all the curved edges, as well as cutting off your corners, you'll find that it lays neater once it is turned. Once you've turned it, it should look a bit like a sack. Just make sure that you've pulled out all the edges. Then you're just going to want to top stitch around the entire way to help it hold its position. I still like to use my 1/4 inch foot, but rather than lining the edge up to the guide, I like to line it up to the edge of the foot. Once that's stitched round all the way, we just need to add our button. Check what position you want to put it in first. Then the type of button I'm using is for hand sewing, so I'm just going to go ahead and stitch that in place. Then you have a beautiful finished cape ready for swirling and twirling.
Swish my cape. Swish, 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 swish. Ta-da!
Thank you so much. You're such a clever girl.
Can I take a photo of you, Mummy?
Oh, if you want. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, don't forget you can always hit like or subscribe. You can also visit us at www.sewingbeefabrics.co.uk, where you'll see a whole load of other sewing tutorials, as well as a lot of the fabrics that were featured in the cape. Thanks for watching. Bye.